Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from rural Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. It was an early autumn day in 1877 when the Harlan County Sheriff first received reports about the strange occurrences at the Caldwell property. The farmhouse stood isolated at the end of a winding dirt path that stretched nearly 3 miles from the main road, nestled between the dense forests and rolling hills of eastern Kentucky. Few ventured that far into the wilderness unless absolutely necessary. The Caldwells kept to themselves, appearing in town only when supplies could no longer be postponed. According to county records, the family consisted of 3 sisters, Tabitha, Mercy, and Cordelia, who had inherited the property following their parents' deaths from fever in 1868. What most townsfolk didn't know was that Josiah Caldwell, the patriarch of the family, had not succumbed to illness as officially recorded. His fate was far more sinister, a secret buried beneath layers of silence and isolation that would only be uncovered through the diligent work of Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Montgomery, whose detailed journal serves as our primary source for this account. The first indication that something was amiss came from a traveling peddler named Abraham Whitaker, who, having lost his way during a storm, sought shelter at the Caldwell farm. In his sworn statement to the sheriff, Whitaker described hearing unsettling moans emanating from beneath the floorboards of the main house. When he inquired about the source of the sounds, Tabitha Caldwell, the eldest sister at 36 years of age, dismissed his concerns, attributing the noise to the wind playing tricks through the foundation stones. Whitaker might have accepted this explanation had he not witnessed Mercy, the middle sister, descending into the cellar, carrying what appeared to be a bowl of thin gruel and returning with an empty dish. His curiosity piqued, Whitaker attempted to engage the sisters in conversation about their cellar, only to be met with immediate hostility. According to his testimony, Cordelia, the youngest sister, suggested he mind his affairs if he wished to keep his tongue. Feeling threatened, Whitaker departed at first light, despite the continuing rain. The account might have been dismissed as the imagination of a weary traveler had Whitaker not been known in the county as a reliable man, not given to exaggeration or falsehood. The peddler had traversed the same routes for over 15 years, building a reputation for honest dealings and accurate observations. Sheriff Wallace Pemberton, a cautious man nearing retirement, might have filed the report away had it not triggered his memory of other odd whispers about the Caldwell property over the years. Nothing substantial enough to warrant investigation, but a pattern of unease that had settled around the family like morning mist, present but insubstantial, easily dismissed but persistently returning. The Caldwell property sat on approximately 140 acres of land, primarily forest, with about 20 acres cleared for farming. The sisters grew enough crops to sustain themselves, with occasional surplus sold in town. What drew attention, however, was not their agricultural practices, but rather the deteriorating condition of the once prosperous homestead. Neighbors who had visited during Josiah Caldwell's lifetime recalled a well-maintained farm with a painted house, tended fields, and healthy livestock. By 1877, the property had fallen into disrepair. Paint peeled from weathered boards, fences sagged, and only a few emaciated animals remained in the barn. Yet, despite this apparent poverty, the sisters never sought work elsewhere, nor did they appear malnourished. This contradiction puzzled those who noticed it, though few gave it sustained thought until the events of October 1877 forced a reckoning with the grim reality of the Caldwell farm. What made Whitaker's account particularly troubling to Deputy Montgomery was its similarity to a report filed 3 years earlier by a Methodist circuit preacher who had also sought shelter at the Caldwell farm during inclement weather. Reverend Silas Hammond had likewise mentioned strange sounds from the cellar, though he attributed them to a wounded animal the sisters might be nursing back to health. Hammond had not investigated further, respecting the family's privacy, but the parallel between these accounts, separated by years, suggested a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Montgomery, recently appointed to his position and eager to prove his worth, decided to investigate the matter personally. He documented his approach in his journal. October 15, 1877, rode out to the Caldwell place on pretense of a property tax assessment. The day was clear but cold, the kind that hints at winter's approach. The property appeared neglected but not abandoned. Smoke rose from the chimney, and laundry hung on a line, stiff in the autumn breeze. Montgomery described the approach to the Caldwell property in detail, noting the increasing sense of isolation as he traveled further from town. The main road gives way to a narrower path, which itself deteriorates into little more than a trail marked by wagon wheels. The forest grows denser, the hills steeper, until the outside world seems to recede entirely. It struck me how completely removed from society one would feel living in such a place, particularly during the harsh winter months when snow might make the trail impassable for weeks at a time. Such isolation changes people. I have seen it before. They begin to create their own rules, their own understanding of right and wrong, unchecked by the moderating influence of community. The deputy was greeted by Mercy Caldwell, whom he described as a woman of about 30 years, with a severe countenance and eyes that never seemed to rest on any one thing for long. She invited him inside reluctantly, only after he insisted that the tax assessment required an inspection of the main dwelling. The interior of the house, according to Montgomery's notes, presented a curious juxtaposition. While the exterior shows clear signs of neglect, the interior is maintained with almost obsessive care. Floors swept clean, furniture polished to a gleam, not a dish out of place in the kitchen. It has the feeling of a place waiting for inspection, too perfect to be naturally lived in. During his visit, Montgomery noted that Tabitha Caldwell remained seated by the hearth, never rising to greet him, while Cordelia hovered near what appeared to be the cellar door, her hand resting on its latch as if guarding it. When Montgomery inquired about seeing the outbuildings to complete his assessment, Mercy quickly offered to show him the barn, steering him away from the cellar. Montgomery's attention to detail revealed additional peculiarities about the Caldwell sisters. Tabitha, the eldest, wore her gray-streaked hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, giving her an eternally vigilant expression. She spoke little, but watched everything with unnerving intensity. Mercy, by contrast, seemed perpetually in motion, her hands fidgeting with her apron, her gaze darting from object to object as if cataloging potential threats. Cordelia, youngest at 28, displayed a strange childlike quality in her speech and mannerisms, at odds with the hardness in her eyes. All three sisters wore identical high-necked dresses of faded black, giving them the appearance of crows gathered in silent judgment. Montgomery's suspicions deepened when he observed a heavy iron padlock on the outside of the cellar door, an unusual security measure for a space typically used for food storage. More telling was the reaction of the sisters when he casually mentioned it. Tabitha's knuckles whitened on her chair arms, he wrote, while Cordelia moved to stand directly before the door, as if her slight frame could prevent my approach. When asked about the lock, Mercy explained that they had trouble with raccoons and other vermin getting into their preserved foods, necessitating the extra security. Montgomery noted that this explanation seemed rehearsed, delivered too quickly, and with an unnatural calm that contrasted with the tension evident in the sisters' postures. The farm inspection revealed other troubling signs. Behind the barn, Montgomery discovered what appeared to be a small cemetery with 4 crude markers, 3 weathered and clearly older, 1 relatively recent. None bore names or dates. When questioned, Mercy claimed they marked the graves of beloved family dogs, though the size of the plot suggested otherwise. In the barn itself, Montgomery noted tools hanging on the wall in perfect alignment, unnaturally clean for farm implements. Most striking was a collection of surgical instruments laid out on a workbench, scalpels, clamps, and a bone saw, all meticulously maintained. When he inquired about these, Cordelia explained that they had belonged to their mother's brother, a surgeon who had died in the war. They kept them as a remembrance, she said, though this failed to explain their pristine condition or prominent display. Following his initial visit, Montgomery began to discreetly gather information about the Caldwell family from longtime residents of Harlan County. What emerged was a portrait of a family that had gradually withdrawn from community life following the death of Sarah Caldwell, Josiah's wife, in 1862. Josiah, described by those who knew him as a stern but fair man, had retreated into religious fervor after his wife's passing, keeping his daughters increasingly isolated on the farm. Several accounts mentioned Josiah's growing paranoia in the years following the Civil War, his conviction that outsiders meant to steal what was rightfully his. This paranoia apparently extended to potential suitors for his daughters, whom he drove away with threats and, on at least one occasion, with a loaded shotgun. By 1868, the year of his reported death, Josiah had not been seen in town for nearly 6 months. His death was not verified by any physician. The sisters simply appeared at the county clerk's office to register his passing, citing fever as the cause. Eudora Winfield, the elderly proprietor of the general store, provided Montgomery with the most comprehensive history of the Caldwell family. According to her account, recorded in the deputy's journal, the Caldwells had once been respected members of the community. Josiah had served as a deacon in the local church, and Sarah had organized aid for families struggling after poor harvests. They were good people, Winfield recalled, until Sarah took sick. It wasn't just fever, like they said. There was something wrong with her mind toward the end. She would speak of shadows watching her, of voices calling from the walls. Josiah kept her home, away from people, ashamed perhaps of what she had become. After she died, something in him broke. He spoke of her illness as divine punishment, though for what sin, he never said. Winfield described how, in the years following Sarah's death, Josiah began to impose increasingly harsh restrictions on his daughters. They were forbidden to speak to men outside his presence, required to cover themselves completely, even in the summer heat, and subjected to lengthy readings from religious texts that Josiah interpreted in ways that emphasized obedience and the inherent corruption of the flesh. The girls changed, Winfield observed. They had been lively, especially Cordelia, the youngest. She had a talent for music, used to sing in the church choir with a voice that could make you believe in angels. After a while, they stopped coming to services. When you did see them in town, they were different, quiet, watchful, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. The last time I saw Josiah, maybe a year before they reported him dead, he looked terrible, thin, wild-eyed. He purchased supplies without a word, but as he was leaving, he leaned close and told me to pray for his family, that they were engaged in a great spiritual battle. I never saw him again. The portrait that emerged from these accounts was of a family warped by grief, isolation, and religious extremism. Josiah, once a pillar of the community, had become a tyrant in his own home, his daughters both victims and eventually collaborators in the creation of a closed system of belief and behavior entirely separate from the wider world. This background lent credence to Montgomery's growing suspicion that something terrible had happened at the Caldwell farm, something that continued to reverberate through the lives of the three sisters and possibly explained the strange sounds reported from the cellar. What happened next pieced together the grim reality of life at the Caldwell farm. Montgomery, unable to shake his concerns about the cellar, returned to the property after dark on October 17, 1877, intending only to observe from a distance. In his journal, he described positioning himself at the edge of the forest line with a clear view of the house. At approximately 9 o'clock, he observed a curious ritual. All three sisters emerged onto the porch carrying lanterns. They formed a triangle and stood in silence for several minutes, before Tabitha nodded, and they proceeded to the cellar doors, which opened outward from the ground at the side of the house. Mercy unlocked the padlock, while Cordelia held both lanterns aloft. They descended into the darkness below, remaining there for approximately 20 minutes before emerging again. What struck me was not just this strange nighttime visit to their cellar, but their expressions upon emerging, a mixture of what I can only describe as revulsion and satisfaction. Montgomery continued his observation for 3 consecutive nights, witnessing the same ritual each time. On the 3rd night, he moved closer to the house after the sisters had returned inside, hoping to hear any sounds from the cellar that might confirm or disprove his suspicions. What he heard, according to his journal, was a low, continuous moan, neither animal nor fully human, but something in between. The sound of a creature that once knew language, but has been reduced to something more primitive by suffering. This confirmation of Whitaker's account convinced Montgomery that intervention was necessary, but he recognized the need for official sanction. The following morning, he presented his observations to Sheriff Pemberton, requesting a formal search warrant for the Caldwell property. Pemberton, though troubled by Montgomery's report, hesitated to take action based solely on strange behavior and unidentified sounds. Peculiarity is not a crime, he reminded the deputy, and we have no evidence of actual wrongdoing. The sheriff suggested that Montgomery make one more official visit, this time with the pretext of completing his tax assessment, and attempt to engage the sisters in conversation about their father's death. If there is something untoward about Josiah Caldwell's passing, Pemberton advised, direct questioning might reveal inconsistencies in their account. Montgomery agreed to this approach, planning to return to the Caldwell farm the following day. Fate, however, intervened with gruesome timing. Montgomery's opportunity to investigate further came unexpectedly 3 days later, when a messenger arrived in town with news that Mercy Caldwell had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine nearly a mile from the farmhouse. Her death was presumed accidental. She had apparently been gathering herbs and had fallen from a significant height. With only 2 sisters remaining at the property, Montgomery accompanied the coroner to retrieve Mercy's body and investigate the circumstances of her death. While the coroner examined the scene of the accident, Montgomery visited the farmhouse to inform Tabitha and Cordelia. He found them already aware of their sister's death, dry-eyed and almost eerily composed. More disturbing still was their lack of questions about how Mercy had died. They simply nodded when informed of the fall, as if this news confirmed what they already knew. The scene at the ravine presented its own mysteries. Mercy's body lay at the bottom of a steep slope, her neck broken from the fall. But several details troubled the coroner, Dr. Hiram Bennett. First, the location was strange, a dangerous area well known to local residents and typically avoided, particularly by someone as familiar with the terrain as Mercy would have been. Second, the basket she had supposedly used to gather herbs was found some distance from her body, its contents scattered in a way that suggested it had been thrown rather than dropped. Most significantly, Mercy's hands showed defensive wounds, deep cuts across the palms consistent with warding off an attack from a blade. When Dr. Bennett pointed out these inconsistencies to Montgomery, the deputy's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Mercy Caldwell had not died accidentally. She had been murdered, likely by one or both of her sisters. Taking advantage of the circumstances, Montgomery offered to help the sisters with any immediate needs, suggesting he could check their food stores to see if they required supplies from town. His real intention, transparent though it might have been, was to gain access to the cellar. Surprisingly, Tabitha agreed, though she insisted on accompanying him. The cellar doors were unlocked, the first time Montgomery had seen them without the padlock secured. As he described in his journal, the smell hit me first, a putrid combination of human waste, unwashed flesh, and something metallic that I recognized as the scent of old blood. The cellar was larger than I expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. A single lantern illuminated the space, revealing root vegetables in bins, preserved fruits in jars along crude shelves, and in the furthest corner, partially hidden behind a stack of empty barrels, what appeared at first glance to be a pile of rags, but revealed itself to be a human form. What Montgomery discovered in that cellar would shock the conscience of the county and become one of the most disturbing cases in Kentucky's history. Chained to the wall by both wrists and one ankle was Josiah Caldwell, emaciated, filthy, but very much alive. His beard and hair had grown wild, reaching past his waist. His fingernails had curled into yellowed talons, and his skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent quality from years without sunlight. Most disturbing were his eyes, wide, alert, and filled with a terrible awareness. This was no man driven to madness by his confinement. This was a man who understood completely the horror of his situation. When Montgomery approached him, Josiah did not speak, but made a low, keening sound, the same moans that both Whitaker and Reverend Hammond had reported hearing years apart. The deputy's discovery triggered an immediate chain of events. He drew his service revolver and ordered Tabitha to step away from the cellar entrance. Her response, recorded in his journal, revealed the depth of the sister's detachment from normal human feeling. "You don't understand what you're seeing," she told him calmly. "This is not cruelty, but necessity. He must remain here, contained, until his corruption is fully drawn out." When Montgomery insisted on releasing Josiah immediately, Tabitha made no move to stop him, but warned, "His chains are the only thing protecting you from what he has become." This statement, initially interpreted as the raving of a disturbed mind, would take on new significance in light of later discoveries. Montgomery summoned assistance from town, and within hours a group including Sheriff Pemberton, Dr. Bennett, and several deputies arrived at the Caldwell farm. Josiah was carefully freed from his chains and lifted from the cellar on an improvised stretcher, his frail body barely registering on the weight-bearing canvas. Throughout the process, Tabitha and Cordelia offered no resistance, observing the proceedings with an unsettling detachment. When Pemberton informed them they were under arrest for the imprisonment and torture of their father, Tabitha merely nodded and said, "We knew this day would come. It is part of the cycle." Both sisters allowed themselves to be taken into custody without protest, their calm compliance almost more disturbing than resistance would have been. According to the medical examination conducted after Josiah's rescue, he had been kept chained in the cellar for approximately 9 years, fed just enough to keep him alive, but permanently weakened. His muscles had atrophied, and he would never walk again. More disturbing were the signs of ongoing torment, small methodical cuts along his arms and legs that had been inflicted at regular intervals, some fresh, others long, healed into scars. The purpose of these wounds became clear only after Montgomery searched the house thoroughly and discovered Tabitha's journal, kept meticulously since 1868, detailing the sisters' beliefs and actions. The journal, written in a precise, almost architectural hand, began as a conventional diary recording daily events at the farm. The early entries mentioned tensions between Josiah and his daughters, particularly regarding his increasing religious strictures and their desire for greater independence. A significant shift occurred in entries from late 1867, when Tabitha began to describe strange dreams in which her deceased mother appeared to her, warning that Josiah was no longer himself, but had been occupied by something else. These dreams, initially dismissed by Tabitha as manifestations of grief, gradually took on the quality of visitations, with Sarah providing increasingly specific instructions about how to contain the corruption that had allegedly taken root in Josiah. From Tabitha's writings emerged a twisted logic born of isolation, grief, and the warping influence of their father's religious paranoia. After their mother's death, Josiah had become convinced that Sarah's passing was divine punishment for his moral failings. He imposed increasingly harsh restrictions on his daughters, particularly regarding contact with men, whom he viewed as inherently corrupting. According to Tabitha's journal, In the winter of 1867-1868, Josiah discovered that 19-year-old Cordelia had been secretly meeting a young man from a neighboring farm. His rage was apocalyptic. He locked Cordelia in the root cellar for 3 days without food, instructing her sisters to ignore her cries. When Tabitha and Mercy finally persuaded him to release Cordelia, they found their younger sister changed, silent, withdrawn, and filled with a cold hatred for their father that mirrored their own growing resentment. The journal described what happened next with disturbing detachment. Father slept more soundly than usual that night, likely exhausted from his righteous fury. It required little effort for the three of us to bind him. He woke confused rather than afraid, not believing his daughters capable of such action against him. Even as we dragged him to the cellar, he spoke not in anger but in disappointment, as if we were misbehaving children who would soon be properly chastised. It was only when Mercy secured the chains and I explained that this would be his new dwelling that fear entered his eyes. "You cannot do this," he said. "I am your father." Cordelia answered him, "You forfeited that right when you made this house a prison." What began as an act of revenge evolved into something far more disturbing. Tabitha's journal entries became increasingly preoccupied with the notion that their father was not merely cruel, but somehow corrupted by an external force, a darkness or taint, that had entered him following Sarah's death and grown stronger over time. This belief system incorporated elements of folk superstition, religious doctrine, and the sisters' own invented rituals, creating a comprehensive delusion that justified their treatment of Josiah as not just revenge, but a form of spiritual quarantine. "We are not his jailers, but his saviors," Tabitha wrote. "By containing his physical form, we prevent the spread of his corruption to others. By drawing out small quantities of his tainted blood, we gradually purify him." This ritualistic bloodletting became central to the sisters' shared delusion. According to the journal, they collected small amounts of Josiah's blood during the new moon, mixing it with herbs and consuming it in the belief that it would transfer his vitality to them while simultaneously weakening the corruption within him. This practice, combining folk superstition with their own invented rituals, reflected a profound psychological break with reality, a shared psychosis that had sustained their strange existence for nearly a decade. Dr. Bennett, upon reviewing these passages, noted that such shared delusions were not unheard of in isolated settings, particularly among family members with strong emotional bonds and shared traumatic experiences. The sisters maintained their father in a state of permanent weakness through careful control of his diet, providing just enough nutrition to keep him alive, but never enough to regain strength. The journal described periods when Josiah attempted to resist or escape, met with increased restriction and punishment. Most chilling were Tabitha's descriptions of how they would sometimes deny him food entirely for days if he tried to call out to rare visitors or became rebellious in his speech. "Hunger is purifying," she wrote. "When the body weakens, so does its capacity to harbor corruption. In his moments of greatest physical weakness, we sometimes glimpse our true father beneath the taint that has claimed him." Over time, the journal revealed, Josiah stopped attempting to reason with his daughters or call for help. His world contracted to the dimensions of his cellar prison, his existence reduced to the basic rhythms of suffering, temporary relief, and renewed suffering. Yet even in this diminished state, he retained an awareness that Tabitha found disturbing. "His eyes follow us always," she wrote in an entry from 1874. "They contain no madness, only a terrible lucidity. Sometimes I wonder if the corruption is gone and only Father remains, silently judging us for what we have done. But then I remember Mother's warnings, how she told me the darkness would try to trick us into releasing it. We must remain vigilant." The death of Mercy disrupted this twisted equilibrium. Montgomery's investigation revealed that Mercy's accident was anything but. Forensic examination showed defensive wounds on her hands and bruising consistent with a struggle before her fall. Montgomery theorized, based on evidence from Tabitha's journal, that Mercy had begun to question their treatment of their father, perhaps even suggesting they release him or end his suffering permanently. This crisis of conscience had been met with violence from Tabitha, the architect of their shared delusion, who could not tolerate any threat to the world she had created. Whether Cordelia participated in Mercy's death remained unclear, though her complicity in the years of torment was undeniable. The final entries in Tabitha's journal, written just days before Mercy's death, described increasing tension between the sisters. M. speaks of doubt, of ending what we began, Tabitha wrote, using only initials to refer to her sisters, a practice she adopted in later entries. She does not understand that there can be no end until the purification is complete. She speaks of mercy, but true mercy lies in seeing the work through to its conclusion, however long that may take. C still believes, but I see how M's words affect her. Seeds of doubt once planted grow like weeds. I fear what may become necessary to preserve our sacred purpose. This entry, with its ominous foreshadowing, was the last coherent passage in the journal. The final page contained only a single sentence, written in a more hurried hand. What is done cannot be undone. The authorities took Josiah to the county hospital, where he remained for several weeks before being transferred to the care of his brother, who lived near Louisville. According to medical records, Josiah never spoke again, communicating only through written notes, and primarily with his attending nurse, rather than family members. He died 6 months after his rescue, his body too damaged by years of deprivation to recover. In one of the few notes he left behind, addressed to Montgomery, he wrote, "I know what they believed they were doing. The tragedy is not that they imprisoned me, but that I imprisoned them first, with fear, with Scripture misused, with a father's authority perverted to tyranny. We were all captives in that house." Tabitha and Cordelia Caldwell were arrested and charged with false imprisonment, torture, and in Tabitha's case, the murder of Mercy. Their trial became a sensation, drawing observers from as far away as Cincinnati and Nashville, all eager to glimpse the Caldwell sisters, as they came to be known in newspaper accounts. The Louisville Courier-Journal described them as unnaturally calm, like statues carved from pale stone, exhibiting neither remorse nor distress at their circumstances. The Cincinnati Enquirer painted a more sensationalized picture, calling them feminine fiends whose angelic appearances mask demonic souls, a characterization that reflected the public's difficulty reconciling the sisters' ordinary appearance with the extraordinary cruelty they had inflicted. The trial revealed the extent to which isolation and trauma can warp human psychology. The defense attempted to portray the sisters as victims of their father's tyranny, who had suffered a collective break with reality. Psychological experts testified about the phenomenon of shared psychosis, whereby individuals living in isolation can develop and maintain complex delusional systems, particularly when those delusions serve to justify actions that would otherwise be morally reprehensible. The prosecution, however, emphasized the calculated nature of the sisters' actions, the careful maintenance of appearances in town, the consistent stories told to visitors, and the methodical record-keeping in Tabitha's journal, all indicating awareness of the wrongfulness of their conduct. Throughout the trial, Tabitha maintained a posture of calm certainty, occasionally nodding as if in confirmation of points made by witnesses or attorneys, but never displaying emotion. Cordelia presented a more complex figure. She frequently appeared confused, particularly during technical testimony, and sometimes whispered urgently to her court-appointed attorney. On the third day of proceedings, when photographs of the cellar were presented as evidence, she broke down sobbing, the only display of emotion from either sister during the entire trial. This moment was seized upon by the defense as evidence of Cordelia's regret and her status as a victim of Tabitha's influence. The prosecution countered by pointing out that Cordelia had participated in her father's captivity for 9 years without taking any action to help him or alert authorities, suggesting that any remorse she felt was too little, too late. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Tabitha unexpectedly requested to address the court. Speaking in a clear, measured voice that betrayed no nervousness or shame, she delivered what amounted to a defense not of her innocence, but of the rightness of her actions. What we did out of necessity. You see only the physical reality, a man chained in darkness. What you cannot see is the spiritual reality, a corruption contained, a spreading taint isolated and gradually diminished. You call us monsters, but we are guardians who sacrificed our own comfort, our own place in society, to protect others from what our father had become. If that is a crime in your eyes, so be it. But know that in chaining him, we freed something more important than his body. We freed his soul from the darkness that had claimed it. This speech, recorded verbatim by the court stenographer, was widely reprinted in newspapers across the country, fueling debate about the sisters' mental state. Some medical professionals pointed to it as clear evidence of delusion, while others suggested it might be a calculated attempt to lay groundwork for an insanity defense. Religious leaders were divided, with some condemning the invocation of spiritual justification for cruelty and others questioning whether the isolation and religious extremism of the Caldwell household might indeed have created conditions where such distorted thinking could flourish. For most ordinary citizens, however, Tabitha's statement simply confirmed what they already believed, that the Caldwell sisters were either mad women or evil incarnate, perhaps both. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for both sisters. Tabitha was sentenced to hang for the murder of Mercy, while Cordelia received life imprisonment for her role in their father's captivity and torture. Historical records indicate that Tabitha maintained her belief in the righteousness of their actions until the end, refusing last rites and telling the prison chaplain that she would rather face damnation than seek forgiveness for doing what was necessary. She was executed on April 22, 1878, the first woman hanged in Harlan County. Cordelia's fate was different. Contemporary accounts describe her as retreating further into silence during her imprisonment, eventually refusing food and dying of self-starvation less than a year into her sentence. In the months following the trial, the case continued to generate discussion in medical and legal circles. Dr. Alistair Thornton, a physician from Philadelphia who had taken an interest in the case, published a paper in 1879 titled Isolation and Shared Delusion, the Caldwell Case as Illustration of Environmental Influence on Mental Functioning. In it, he argued that the sisters' behavior, while inexcusable, was comprehensible as the product of a perfect storm of contributing factors. Genetic predisposition, citing Sarah Caldwell's reported mental illness, religious extremism, trauma, isolation, and the intense emotional bonds between the three women. In such an environment, he wrote, reality itself becomes malleable, subject to redefinition according to the internal logic of the delusion. The Caldwell sisters did not exist in the same moral universe as their neighbors. They had created their own cosmology in which the imprisonment and torture of their father was not merely justified but necessary and even virtuous. This perspective, revolutionary for its time, suggested that mental illness should be understood not simply as an individual failing or moral defect, but as the product of environmental and social factors. Thornton's paper influenced early psychiatric approaches to shared psychotic disorders and highlighted the dangers of extreme isolation, particularly in family units with unbalanced power dynamics. Later scholars would point to the Caldwell case as an early example of what would now be recognized as trauma-induced psychosis, complicated by religious delusion and the echo chamber effect of isolation. The Caldwell farmhouse stood abandoned for several years following the trial, becoming a grim local landmark that children dared each other to approach after dark. In 1883, a lightning strike during a summer storm ignited the dry timber of the structure, reducing it to ashes. Local residents described the fire as unusually intense, consuming not just the house but also the outbuildings, with a ferocity that prevented any attempt to control the blaze. Some viewed this destruction as a cleansing, the land finally purged of the horrors it had witnessed. Others, more superstitious, saw it as Josiah Caldwell's final act, his spirit ensuring that no one else would ever occupy the space where he had suffered so terribly. In the years immediately following the fire, locals reported strange phenomena associated with the property: lights visible at night where no structure stood, the sound of chains rattling carried on the wind, a woman's weeping heard from the ruins of the cellar. These accounts, recorded by Montgomery in an appendix to his journal, reflect the impact of the Caldwell case on the collective imagination of the community rather than genuine supernatural occurrences. The horror of what had happened was too great to be contained by ordinary understanding. It leaked into the realm of legend, becoming a story told to frighten children and warn adults about the dangers lurking in isolation and unchecked authority. The land changed hands several times in the decades following the Caldwell case, but no one attempted to rebuild on the original homestead site. In 1892, a farmer named Jeremiah Collins purchased the property with the intention of clearing the remaining land for crops. According to local newspaper accounts, Collins abandoned this plan after his workers uncovered human remains while digging near the former barn. Not the 4 marked graves Montgomery had noted, but 2 additional unmarked burials. Examination by the county coroner determined that these were the remains of adult men, both showing signs of violent death, one with a crushed skull, the other with cut marks on the vertebrae, consistent with having his throat slit. The estimated time of burial placed both deaths during the period when the Caldwell sisters controlled the property, suggesting dimensions to their crimes beyond what had been revealed at trial. These discoveries lent credence to a theory Montgomery had developed but never proven, that the Caldwell sisters' delusion about their father's corruption might have extended to other men who had the misfortune to cross their path. The deputy had noted in his journal his suspicion that Whitaker had not been the first traveler to seek shelter at the Caldwell farm, merely the first to leave alive. The newly discovered remains could not be identified, but their presence confirmed that the full extent of the sisters' crimes might never be known. How many travelers, lost or seeking shelter, had entered the Caldwell property never to leave? How many families had waited in vain for the return of men who had disappeared without trace on the roads of eastern Kentucky? The case of the Caldwell sisters faded from public memory as the decades passed, preserved primarily in court records, newspaper archives, and Montgomery's journal, which was donated to the County Historical Society following his death in 1912. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the physical cruelty inflicted on Josiah Caldwell, but the psychological dimensions of his torment, imprisoned by his own daughters, fully aware of his circumstances, unable to comprehend how the children he had raised could subject him to such treatment. It represents a complete inversion of familial bonds and obligations, a perversion of the natural order that most find more disturbing than random violence between strangers. For Josiah, the particular horror of his situation lay not just in the physical suffering, but in the daily reminder that those he had raised and loved had become his tormentors. In the few communications he left behind, he never expressed hatred for his daughters, but rather a profound sadness and sense of responsibility. "I made them what they became," he wrote to his brother shortly before his death. "In my grief, I became a tyrant in my own home, using God's word as a whip to keep them in line. Their punishment of me was terrible, but perhaps not unjust, only greatly disproportionate. What they did to me, they learned from what I did to them, only they had more time and creativity than I. We created a hell together, each believing we were doing God's work." This reflection raises uncomfortable questions about cycles of abuse and the transmission of trauma through generations. Josiah's tyrannical behavior following his wife's death created conditions of fear, resentment, and distorted thinking that, combined with isolation, allowed his daughters to develop their own twisted mirror image of his control. Their imprisonment of their father represented both a rebellion against his authority and a perverse continuation of the patterns he had established: control through fear, punishment justified by appeals to higher purpose, the sublimation of natural human feeling to abstract principle. In this sense, the Cellar merely made literal the psychological prison Josiah had created for his family years earlier. Modern analysis of the case suggests that the isolation of rural life in post-Civil War Kentucky created conditions where such extreme behaviors could develop and persist undetected. The Caldwell farm's remote location, combined with the cultural tendency toward non-interference in family matters, allowed the sisters to maintain their father's imprisonment for years without raising serious concern. Even when outsiders heard suspicious sounds or noticed odd behaviors, they were quick to accept explanations rather than probe deeper. This reluctance to intervene, to look too closely at what might be happening behind closed doors, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case for contemporary observers. The recognition that similar situations might exist even now, hidden in plain sight. The story of the Caldwell sisters also illustrates the dangers of isolation on the human mind. Removed from the stabilizing influence of community, from the constant minor corrections to perception and belief that social interaction provides, the sisters created a closed system of meaning that, while internally consistent, was fundamentally detached from consensus reality. Within the boundaries of their farm, their treatment of their father made perfect sense according to their shared delusion. It was only when this private reality collided with the larger social world through Montgomery's investigation that its terrible divergence from normal human understanding became apparent. In the years following the Caldwell case, Harlan County established more regular patrols by law enforcement to remote areas, partly in response to public concern about isolated families. The case also influenced early discussions about mental health intervention in Kentucky, with several physicians citing the Caldwell sisters in articles advocating for more attention to the psychological effects of isolation and trauma. Though primitive by modern standards, these early recognitions of the connection between environment and mental stability represented important steps toward a more comprehensive understanding of human psychology. The land where the Caldwell farm once stood was eventually purchased by a timber company in the early 1900s, and the area was logged extensively. Today, second-growth forest covers the site, with nothing remaining to indicate the horrors that once transpired there. Occasionally, local history enthusiasts or those drawn to the macabre will attempt to locate the exact position of the farmhouse using old survey maps and Montgomery's descriptions, but the landscape has changed too much for precise identification. Perhaps this obscuration is fitting, the physical traces erased while the story remains. A cautionary tale about the darkness that can fester in isolation and the terrible consequences when familial bonds twist into something unrecognizable. For those who study criminal psychology, the Caldwell case stands as an early documented instance of shared psychotic disorder, or what is sometimes called folie à trois, when it involves three individuals. The condition in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one dominant individual to others in close proximity is rare but not unique to the Caldwell sisters. What makes their case particularly notable is the duration and elaboration of their shared delusion, the ritualistic elements they developed, and the ways in which they maintained functional contact with the outside world while harboring their terrible secret. They were not obviously insane in casual interaction. They maintained the social facades necessary to deflect suspicion. This high-functioning presentation alongside profound delusion represents a particularly disturbing manifestation of mental illness, challenging simplistic notions of madness as all was visibly apparent. The ritualistic aspects of the Caldwell sisters' behavior, the ceremonial bloodletting, The triangle formation before entering the cellar, the meticulous record-keeping, suggest how humans impose order on chaos, create meaning in suffering, even when that meaning is entirely divorced from conventional morality. Tabitha's journal, with its precise documentation of their sacred work, reveals a mind desperately seeking patterns and purpose, transforming an initial act of revenge into an elaborate spiritual mission spanning nearly a decade. The development of their private mythology, complete with its own symbols and ceremonies, demonstrates the human need for narrative coherence even within the most disturbed mental states. What lessons can be drawn from the Caldwell case beyond its value as a historical curiosity? Perhaps the most important is the recognition of how thin the veneer of civilization can be, how quickly isolation and trauma can erode the social bonds and shared understandings that keep human behavior within certain boundaries. The Caldwell sisters were not born monsters. They became monstrous through a complex interaction of circumstance, psychology, and choice. Their story serves as a reminder of the importance of community, as a check on individual or family unit delusion, of the dangers inherent in extreme religious interpretation without moderating social influence, and of the potential for cycles of abuse to escalate in horrific ways when unchecked by outside intervention. The case of Josiah Caldwell and his daughters serves as a reminder that true horror often has little to do with the supernatural. No ghosts or monsters were needed to create the nightmare at the Caldwell farm. Only human beings, damaged by circumstance and isolation, capable of justifying unspeakable cruelty through their own warped logic. In the quiet hollows of rural Kentucky, far from the moderating influence of community and social norms, the boundaries of acceptable behavior blurred until they disappeared entirely, leaving only the terrible freedom of those who recognize no limits to what they might do to another human being, even one who should have been protected by the most fundamental bonds of family. If you listen closely on certain autumn nights, when the wind whistles through the valleys of Harlan County, some say you can still hear an echo of Josiah Caldwell's moans, not a supernatural manifestation, but the collective memory of a community that learned too late the dangers of looking away, of respecting privacy to the point of enabling cruelty. It is a sound that reminds us how thin the veneer of civilization can become when isolation and trauma combine, and how vigilant we must remain against the darkness that can grow in human hearts when left unchecked and unwitnessed. The true terror of the Caldwell case is not that it happened, but that similar horrors may be unfolding even now, behind closed doors, in places where people have learned to mind their own affairs at any cost.